Good morning, and welcome everyone to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. This morning, we're delighted to welcome President Jin Liqun of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where he will deliver a public lecture for us. The plan of this meeting will be that he has agreed to speak for about 30 minutes, and then after which we will engage in a 30-minute question and answer session. I will need to end this session precisely at 10:30. So those are the rules. Let me properly now welcome you. The AIIB, or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is today, in my view, the world's leading multilateral institution seeking to improve economic and social well-being across Asia through investment in infrastructure. And we're delighted, of course, that AIIB's president, Mr. Jin, is with us today to deliver this public lecture. The need for improved Asian infrastructure has long been recognized. It was the first decade of this millennium that the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank Institute, based in Tokyo, famously estimated that Asia would need at least $800 billion a year worth of infrastructure investment to maintain the region's trajectory of growth and development. $800 billion a year. So market demand was already apparent. The question, where was supply? In 2013, China's President Xi Jinping officially launched the initiative to establish the AIIB. But of course, on the world stage, setting up institutions to make possible such large flows of capital was never going to be a project only of engineering and economics. In March 2015, Britain became the first major Western economy to apply to join the AIIB. And in quick response, a United States official criticized the British for Britain's constant appeasement of a rising power. But soon after that, other European states, including France and Germany and Italy, also applied for AIIB membership. The United States went on to express concerns that any multilateral institution should meet the high standards set by, in its view, among others, the World Bank, on good governance and on environmental and social protection. Mr. Jin Liqun became the founding president of AIIB in 2016, starting then with 57 international members and a registered capital of $100 billion. Today, AIIB has grown to have 100 members across the globe. By all accounts, AIIB continues to practice the high standards of lending, procurement, and environmental awareness that its early detractors, unfortunately, had accused it of seeking to undermine. I first met Mr. Jin at a conference I organized in September in 2010 at the London School of Economics on sovereign wealth funds. At that time, Mr. Jin was chairman of the Supervisory Board of China Investment Corporation, CIC. But he was also serving as chairman of the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds. It was the international group of sovereign wealth funds advancing the so-called Santiago Principles, an internationally accepted set of principles and practices for the conduct and governance of sovereign wealth funds. He comes into AIIB with the highest of credentials on governance. But even prior to that, Mr. Chin already burnished a distinguished career of service in the international domain. In the 1980s and 1990s, he served in the Chinese Finance Ministry office in Washington, D.C., where he was Director General of the World Bank Department and Alternative Executive Director of China to the World Bank Group. In the early 2000s, Mr. Jin was Vice President of the Asian Development Bank, in charge of South, Central, and West Asia and private sector operations. We are fortunate indeed to have someone like President Jin speak to us this morning. He will describe the establishment and growth of the AIIB. Again, as I said at the beginning, he will speak for about 30 minutes, after which he has agreed to engage in question and answer with this audience. If you could join me in welcoming President Jin Liqun to the stage.
Thank you, Professor Quah. Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, professors. I feel greatly honored and privileged to be invited to speak to you today. But I would say it's an exchange of ideas. I would just try to be humble enough to share with you information about this bank. This is your bank, because Singapore is a founding member of this financial institution. And as you know, as a kid, my dream was to be a professor. I loved to deal with books. I was afraid to deal with humans. But by the perversity of fate, I had to leave my alma mater and to be plunged into this international development business. But it's all right. And as you see, I spent a good 10 years in rural China during the Cultural Revolution, because schools were dismantled and we were all sent to rural China. At that time, we were prepared to spend the rest of our life in rural China. And looking back, at least in retrospect, I know even though you find the fate might be perverse, but there's some kind of subtle relationship. Without my 10 years in rural China in the 60s and the 70s, I could not have such a sense of the aspirations, the dreams of the rural people in China. When I went there was no electricity. It was pretty rich area in China, because south of the Yangtze River had always been very rich. But still, we know the hardships of the people over there. And later on, when I found myself in the development business, I told myself how much I had got by working for a good 10 years in rural areas in China. And then I came to Beijing in 1978 to be a graduate student when the former leader Deng Xiaoping would like to resume the enrollment of college students and graduate students. So I was very happy, and then I think I would go back to the academics and to realize my dream to be a professor. And indeed, that dream was not really very difficult to achieve. And my professor invited me to stay on to join the faculty. He said, "You have a great future. And then you have already published very good academic articles in the journals, and so that's no problem." Then in 1980, President McNamara of the World Bank came to China, and he met Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping decided to open up China, and then we had the change of representation in IMF and the World Bank. And all of a sudden, the Ministry of Finance of China talked to my alma mater, said, we want somebody to be assigned to Washington to work in the World Bank. That was the beginning of my story. But you see, in those days, in the early 1980s, I would say this is the apprenticeship for China to learn about the international development issues. I was certainly an apprentice. 40 years later, China developed and could have the ability to initiate a multilateral development bank, which was really, in my view, is something we never expected. But why President Xi Jinping initiated the creating of a new bank? Obviously, given China's experience and experience of Singapore and so many Asian countries, we understood infrastructure development could pave the path for sustained long-term development. That is why this bank was called an infrastructure bank. But it's not the whole story. Why should we try to create a new bank while World Bank, AIIB, the existing AIIBs have been working wonderfully well over these years, helping the Asian countries and the rest of the world? So with so important institutions already working, is it necessary to set up a new bank? So first, the importance of infrastructure development and the lack of funds for financing infrastructure. Secondly, how to deal with that? We need a bank. But what is the function, what is the mission of this institution? It's really a very, very important issue. And then the third, how many countries should be invited? Is this going to be inclusive or just an Asian investment bank, infrastructure investment bank? So we could work among the Asian countries. And finally, last but not least, what would be the governance standards of this new institution? So we had to deal with all these very important issues. The conceptualization of such kind of institutions, in my view, is crucial. Because if you had wrong ideas, if you did not design it well, it might be a flop. It may not achieve the very ambitions or missions you intend for yourself. So we started with ASEAN countries. The first meeting was with ASEAN countries. Because connectivity, integration, cooperation, coordination feature prominently in ASEAN and in ASEAN's relationship with Japan, China, Korea. Because I was involved in a number of meetings of 10+3 on all these issues. So we started with ASEAN. But of course, we intended this bank to be inclusive. And at the same time, we started to work on the European countries. And we had meetings with the US Treasury, Japanese Ministry of Finance. We issued the invitations to all of the countries which could be potential, could be prospective founding members. The frequently asked question at that time was the need to set up a new bank when the World Bank had been operating here and AIIB had operating here. So our idea is, in spite of the fact the World Bank, AIIB have been doing wonderful things in this region, we still have a need to have a new bank because we think this bank should be focused on infrastructure. We will not have the sovereign soft windows we do not intend to directly intervene in poverty reduction and social sectors at that time. So there will be some overlapping with the World Bank and AIIB in terms of infrastructure. But we intended to help with environmental protection, poverty reduction, through the development of the economy. That was a different approach. And because of the budget constraints faced by so many countries, we did not want to have the soft window. We did not ask for concession of funding. We would like to have the funding and lending the same as the World Bank's hard loan or AIIB's hard loan. So the idea is not to put more pressure on the governments, except for the capital subscription, which is pretty high, 20%, paid in, 80% callable. But I was involved from the very beginning, having worked 6 years on the board of World Bank, 5 years in AIIB. I know both institutions, both the management and the board, and I thought to myself, we need to create a bank which would remain in the gene pool of the multilateral development banks. It's still a multilateral development bank. Its shareholders are almost all of them sovereign governments, except Hong Kong or Taiwan. All right, we intended to include Taiwan and Hong Kong. So this is an MDB, multilateral development bank. However, its modus operandi should be closer to the private sector companies. To be more efficient, that's the idea. Governance structure more or less like that of the World Bank, EBRD, AIIB. However, we did not want to have the resident board. We want to have the non-resident board. The board would meet 4 times a year instead of residing in the headquarters. We want to have a business line model which would be more efficient rather than the country focus, which in my view will lock up the talents and experts in a particular region. That's kind of institutional rigidity, which implies for higher cost. The US, Japan, and some other countries, including quite a number of Western countries, were very much worried about environmental and social standards. It's false assumption, because they said, we have a huge problem with this bank because we're worried about your environmental standards, we're worried about human rights. The false assumption has really been a huge problem when you deal with something new. And we try to explain to these people what this bank should be or what it shouldn't be, what it should do, what it shouldn't do. But still, some people are not very convinced. You see, I remember, in Mansfield Park, Jane Austen said, the selfishness must be pardoned, she said, because there's no hope of a cure. And I said, skepticism perhaps should be pardoned because there's no hope of a cure. Some people are skeptical, but we stay very calm. I never ever intended to be engaged in a war of words with anybody. We stayed very calm. You don't trust us? No problem. I believe trust has to be earned. Credibility has to be earned. You cannot talk people into believing you. You can only convince people what you do, not about what you say. So we stay very calm. And how about those countries, very important countries, United States, Japan, who remain outside? Now, from the very beginning, we said this bank should be different in 2 very important features. One, we have universal recruitment. When we recruit people, we look at their track record. We look at their professional and ethical integrity. We don't look at their passports. I'm blind to nationality. And international competitive bidding. Any company, regardless of the nationality or the membership of their country, they are qualified to compete for contracts. And we have been actually working very well with American institutions, with American and the Japanese companies. We are working with them. And in my office, in the president's office, we have two gentlemen. One is an American, the other is a British. John Nelson, Mr. Philip Nelson, he's British in my office. So when an Americans, talk to me, I say, you've got some people in my office in the nerve center of AIIB. So, what's the worry? We just want to get the best of the people. So in these two areas, we are different from the existing institutions. And when I was elected as the Secretary General of the Interim Moderator Secretariat, setting up this bank, the first thing I did was to appoint Chief Counsel. Because we need lawyers, right? And Shakespeare said that the first thing we want to kill the lawyers. And the first thing I did was to recruit the lawyers, right? And I appointed Miss Natalie Lichtenstein, an American lady. She served in the U.S. private company, U.S. Treasury, and the World Bank for many years. And she worked for the World Bank in China, and she knows about Asia very well. So when I appointed her to be the chief counsel, one of the chief negotiators of the ASEAN countries asked me a question. He said, Mr. Jin, why did you appoint an American to be the chief counsel, preparing, drafting the Articles Agreement? Don't you think we have lawyers in our country? Don't you think our lawyers are as good? I said, yes, you're right. You have lawyers as good or even better. But let me tell you, there are two things. Do you have lawyers who are willing to work for the setting up of this bank for a very meager honorarium? It's not even salary. At this moment, I work pro bono for the setting up of this bank. And secondly, do you think you have lawyers who are conversant enough about the multilateral development institutions? Okay, so my appointment, my recommendation was supported by everyone. But Miss Natalie Lichtenstein did a wonderful job because she prepared a matrix for the Articles Agreement. This is our bank's Articles Agreement. And then what are the features of the World Bank, EBRD, ADB, AIIB, all this. And you can see the difference and the similarity between this new bank and existing banks. Indeed, I followed the establishment of EBRD very closely. We as a newcomer, we need to learn from the existing ones. We need to learn from the World Bank, ADB, EBRD. In my words, I pick up the pluses from those institutions and avoid the minuses of them. EBRD, as you know, was set up after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The idea was to help with the transition from the former communist countries to the market economy. And defined by the title of this bank, they focused on Russia, former republics of Soviet Union, and Central and Eastern European countries. 15 years later, the European countries talked about shutting down EBRD because the mission was completed. But could you kill a teenager who's doing very well? Of course not. So they had to amend the Articles of Agreement, they had to expand and redefine the mission. So in our bank, we learn from them. You see, Asia Infrastructure Invest Bank's mission is to promote a broad-based economic and social development through investment in infrastructure and other productive sectors. And AIIB's membership is open to the members of the World Bank and ADB. If you look at this, you could be sure that these articles of agreement can serve us for the next 100 years without any amendment. First of all, the members of the World Bank and ADB covers virtually all of the countries. You know why? Because they must be members of the International Monetary Fund. And then we can work with the International Monetary Fund to know the economic situations, and also the surveillance would help us. So it's inclusive. So geographical coverage is such a broad area. So we now have 100 members from all of the continents except Antarctic, right? So the problem is, how about infrastructure and other productive sectors? Now I learned this because EBRD's mission was too narrow, so much so they had to redefine it. So when I proposed infrastructure and other productive sectors, some negotiators asked me, said, Mr. Jin, what do you mean by other productive sectors? I said, other productive sectors means other productive sectors. Okay. Now, you see, we do physical infrastructure today. We may do non-physical infrastructure, hardware infrastructure and software infrastructure. As I discussed with some of the people yesterday, I said, you see, are we prepared for the age of AI? Now, how about education? Are we going to provide the same kind of education to the students who worked very hard, who like crazy, who burn midnight oil, and only to find after their graduation, unemployment is waiting for them because they are not fit for the job market in the future? And how about healthcare? People are living longer. Do you think they should spend the rest of the time in a nursing home? No. We should have these people to be lively and energetic, and they can still contribute to society. My grandmother, who passed away 2 years ago, lived to be 110. Okay. And she was still, walking around when she was 105. So today, when I see very senior people, I never say, I hope you live to be 100 years old, because that's dangerous. And when somebody played such a compliment to an old man, he said, I hope you will live to be 100. And his jaws dropped. According to you, just 1 or 2 years left for me. So I don't do that. And in China, we often say, I hope your longevity is the same as Nanshan and Mount. Don't say that, because these quarries can remove the mountains very quickly, and all these marbles would be decorating buildings. The mountain is no longer there. I don't say that. So I said, for you, 100 years old is the floor, no cap, no ceiling. Okay. So 100 year is the floor, no ceiling, no cap. But then the Ministry of Finance people were very much worried. How can we provide for these people? No worries. Good healthcare, good medical service can help these people continue to contribute to society. I'm very young. I'm just 35 years old twice. Okay, so coming back to the issue. Non-physical infrastructure would be important. Why we focused on physical infrastructure now? We need to think about the future. That's why our Articles Agreement can serve us for the next 100 years without any amendment. Amending anything is painful, right? So don't worry about that. So we are actually developing a bank whose mission complements, supplements that of the World Bank, AIIB, EBRD, other institutions. But we have the 21st century governance. Ours is an institution with a new modus operandi, which could be lean, clean, and green. To be lean, I want to avoid institutional obesity. As the human being, when you grow and you put on a lot of weight, don't do that. Just like me, I go to the gym every day. These suits have served me for the last 10 years without any problem, because my wife would not give me any budget for a new suit. So, and this is not really not a joke. When I asked my wife, so can you please give me some budget because I need a new suit? And she said, if I give you budget, a couple of days later you need another budget, why don't you shrink? The same when you go to the government, hey, we need a capital increase. We need the existing institutions go back to the shareholders asking for capital increase again and again and again. The shareholders say, why don't you shrink? So we need to remain lean, okay? It's not difficult early in the stage, but when we grow 10, 20, 30 years down the road, can we remain very lean? That's a big issue. Clean, zero tolerance of corruption. I have something to brag to you. I was in charge of the World Bank's lending and AIIB's lending and also bilateral lending to China. The total amount, which were under my control at that time, was over $50 billion. Not a single staff in the offices under my supervision was involved in corruption. Not a single one. I remember in 1980, when I was assigned to the World Bank's Executive Director's office, in those days, China was really not doing very well financially, right? And my grandmother, who was in her 70s, when she heard about the news, she said, my grandson, you are now going to manage the money of the whole world, because the World Bank means the bank manages the money of the whole world. I did not have to tell her what kind of bank it is. Anyway, it's a World Bank's money, all right? Keep this in mind, my grandson. Now you have two pockets. One is the public pocket, the other is the private one. Never ever move a single cent from the public pocket to your private pocket. Keep this in mind. For the last 4 decades, I never forget about it. That's why a lot of my former colleagues are happily in prison. Why happily? Because they knew, how come I behave like that? Because, you see, finally, when they were arrested, they could have a sleep at night. Otherwise, they couldn't sleep. And I could have good sleep every night because I feel so confident, things are all right. So for us, zero tolerance for corruption is the key. And when China initiated this bank, a lot of people didn't believe it because China had corruption problems. I said, we want to show this is a bank with zero tolerance for corruption. And then finally, green. We have to be green. Climate change is a major challenge faced by the humans for ASEAN countries, for so many countries. This is such a tough issue. Natural disasters have never been so sweeping, so devastating, and we need to deal with that. That's our job. Even though we did not say this bank is dealing with climate change, actually dealing with climate change is really embedded in our mission. So thank you very much. I'm ready to pick up your questions. Thank you.
Very excellent. Thank you, President Jin. Before I open up to the floor, perhaps I could ask you to, as prerogative, to expand a little bit on when you referred to how AIIB approvals and projects were blind to nationality or blind to someone's history. Can you give us a sense for the range of projects that are out there now? I think there must be several score out there now. So can you give us a sense of what headline we should be thinking about on that regard?
You see, the way we build our pipeline and finance our projects goes like this. First, we reach out to the client countries. I have to clarify one thing. This bank does not have part one countries, which are the donors, part two countries, which are the recipients. Every country is eligible to borrow from this bank. But the developed countries will not do it because they want to have the resources reserved for the developing countries. China is not going to borrow from this bank, except a very minor amount dealing with cross-country border connectivity. So China is not going to borrow in large amount. The developed countries are not going to borrow. Sorry, we approach all of the potential borrowers, asking them to give us project proposals, be it government, institutions, or private sector. When we have these projects proposed to us, then we will process through our internal procedure. So far, transport is the biggest sector, followed by energy, and then water supply, sanitation, and urban development. And we also finance, we invest in the private equity fund, the so-called other productive sectors. But in the future, we will do manufacturing, mining, something like that.
I see.
But the biggest comes from the transport.
I see. Thank you very much. Now we've got quite a few people. If you could go up to the microphone, hang on. So there's quite a number of people already lined up. So I'm afraid you'll have to join the line at the back, please.
Okay, sure.
And then because there are so many questions, I'm going to take 2 or 3 at a time, Mr. President, and then I'll ask you, invite you to respond to them. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dean. Good morning, President Jin. Welcome to our school. My name is Shing. I'm a Chinese graduate from our school and currently a commentary writer based in Singapore. As early as in 2015, before the establishment of the bank, actually I published an article in English here suggesting that Singapore should become the regional headquarters of AIIB. And this year, again, during the second One Belt, One Road Summit, I also published an article in Chinese in 联合早报, again suggesting Singapore become the headquarters, regional headquarters. Many of my Singaporean friends welcome this idea. So I would like to know your opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sun-Shi. We'll come back, take all the questions in group. So over here, please, sir.
Mr. Jin, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Just wanted to touch on the fact that you're the young upstart bank in global multilateral development banking, a bit like Greta Thunberg is the young upstart in terms of climate change. She's rocking the apple cart. She's currently 2 days into what I imagine is quite a rocky transatlantic sailing trip to get to the UN. Can you see a role for the AIIB in sort of upsetting the apple cart in some ways by investing in things that are non-traditional for multilateral development banks in terms of climate change, investing in early innovation in plastic reduction, investing in startups even, because projects that require hundreds of millions of dollars are often not totally aligned to climate change reduction.
Okay, thank you. Then the gentleman just behind you, and then we'll turn over to President. Please, sir.
Yeah, I have 2 very, very short questions, and I think with your wit and sense of humor, you can finish. You can finish answering in 20 seconds. When do you expect the United States and Japan to join? What's your biggest worry and concern? For example, lack of funding or future default? Thank you.
Thank you. Preston, could I invite you to respond to those three quite different, interesting questions?
Singapore has been playing a very important role in the setting up of this bank. Indeed, Singapore's participation from the very beginning to negotiate the artist agreement has enhanced the credibility of this new bank. Because there were a lot of concerns over the governance of the standards of this institution. So Singapore's participation really has contributed substantially in a way which can mitigate a lot of concerns on the part of some of these European countries and North American countries. But I believe Singapore will continue to play a very important role moving forward. And indeed, we have Singaporeans taking care of the very important departments. Human resources department is headed by Singaporean. And the one investment department headed by Singaporean. Our chief ethical officer is Singaporean. If I appoint a Singaporean to be the chief ethical officer, nobody would have any questions about that. They think, oh, the bank is in good hands. So we, as you know, the bank was designed to support infrastructure development, thereby improving socio-economic development. Eventually, we will help deal with poverty reduction. But as you know, in today's world, we cannot finance any infrastructure projects in a very traditional way. We have to take into account the fact that we have to deal with climate change, right? So even without climate change as part of the Arctic Agreement, the concept is deeply embedded in it. Indeed, the bank was up and running just a couple of weeks after Paris Climate Agreement was approved in Paris. So now we are doing a lot to deal with climate change. But we try to define the green economy in a very broad way. For instance, how can you help people to deal with this very, very serious issue? But we have to provide decent living conditions to the people. You still have to drive, you still have to travel, and you still have to have electricity, all this kind of thing. So we promote a green economy. We try to help the countries moving from high carbon to low carbon to zero carbon economy. We improve the mass transit system to avoid individual driving of their cars. And we also improve the power grid transmission systems to cut systemic loss. Do you know in some of these countries, their systemic loss could be as high as 30%. Without building new power plants, we upgrade the transmission line and distribution system. You will see the same amount of electricity generated by the existing plants can serve more people. So all this is part of our efforts. And you see, when we try to set up this bank, we work on the European countries, United States and Japan. And we told them it's different from the 1960s when Japan wanted to have the AIIB. And the former president of AIIB, Dr. Chino, told me, we travel to European countries asking them to come so that we could have some money. Japan in 1960 was not wealthy. So you see, it's very strange. The AIIB's equity power structure, equity structure is 38%, almost 40 are actually developed countries. So it's an Asian development bank, but the majority shareholders are actually non-developing countries. And if Japan takes sides on important issues with European countries, they are the majority. Only in our bank, 75% of the shares are held by the Asian countries. Of course, you can say Singapore developed, Korea developed, Australia, New Zealand. But I know Singapore, in spite of its financial status or economic status, Singapore's heart beats with the hearts of other developing countries, right? And at a non-Asian country, 25%, we have Africans, we have Latin American countries, we have Central European countries. So this is really the development bank with the developing countries as the major shareholder. At the same time, developed countries like UK, Germany, France are playing a very important role working with us. I think this is a wonderful model that developing countries are working together to push for the common objective.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, emphasizing that vision, because it's doing not just physical infrastructure, it's also building a consensus and building a multilateral institution.
Yes.
Thank you. Sir.
Okay. China is very effective in solving global warming. In 2006, I shared with China Power Chief. In 2007, China enacted law prohibit food for energy, bioethanol, and started cultivating thorns in Inner Mongolia. And 2009, the farmer of Inner Mongolia have income of 100,000 renminbi a year. But burning bio-waste is a challenging issue. And China Power Chief now is in One Belt, One Road. May I share how to burn biomass in a creative way?
Sorry, can I ask for a question rather than
this is a suggestion
lecture?
because Mr. Jin is coming for suggestions too. May I share some of these ideas later with you?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, behind you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chin. I enjoyed your talk very much. I'm an academic here at the law school of NUS. I'm also very interested in your green mission, and this links up to the earlier question. I'm wondering whether you have very strict criteria before you fund any projects to evaluate that they meet your minimum green standards. And I wonder whether you have any insights on the role that the private banking sector can and should be playing in green finance in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent question. Over here, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Jin. It was a real pleasure and a privilege to hear you talk and give your insight into a bank that we only read about. So it was a pleasure. I have had the privilege of working with the World Bank for 18 years, most of them on infrastructure. I left the World Bank last year, but based on my work with them, I do have a couple of questions. First of all, I think your multilateral development bank being dedicated to infrastructure specifically is a very powerful mandate, and you are the only bank, only multilateral in the world that has that mandate. And I salute you for that, and it's done a great job thus far. Two questions I have. One is, in addition to lending to sovereign governments, what is the AIIB doing to support and establish new models and new channels to finance infrastructure? In particular, on the private financing side, one way where the bank could help is to support financial interlocutors like PE funds and other private sector institutions, which can indeed make some very wise investments in infrastructure with due attention to environmental and social aspects. So how is your bank supporting this channel, which other multilaterals don't do as an institutional priority? To an extent, the IFC does, but not in the same way as you potentially could. And second, what is AIIB doing to make sure that there is the connection between the new wave of technology, AI, IoT, these kinds of things which indeed have very powerful applications in infrastructure? How are you supporting bringing these as part of the new models, new wave to support and finance infrastructure? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Since there wasn't actually a question but a sharing from early on, I'll take another question now, please.
Hello, President Jin. My name is Jenny from Kyrgyzstan. I'm the student at Lee Kuan Yew School. As Kyrgyzstan, I'm glad to share that Kyrgyzstan is not only the member of AIIB, we are also the member at the Belt and Road Initiative. So my question is, in your membership, there are so many developing and even underdeveloped countries. So bearing in mind, like there might be political instability, non-transparency in their governments, and some high corruption index. I just wonder how AIIB you remain your sustainable business model when you have these members countries, bear in mind, are they able to pay back this infrastructure investment since many of them, they are already in a very heavy debt? And the second quick question is, in your whole lecture in 30 minutes, you never ever mentioned a single word about the Belt and Road Initiative. As most of people know, like this is very important component AIIB, including the Silk Road Fund, right? So what is the role of AIIB in helping and developing the China's grand strategy on Belt and Road? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Excellent question. So I'm going to hold off, invite President Chin to speak to these very interesting questions.
Thank you very much. Now, dealing with the climate change, there could be different, approaches. But as I said, we need to, first of all, try to promote green projects, particularly renewable energy. And the biomass is one of them, but we are not limiting ourselves to any kind of support. This indeed, we are increasingly allocating more resources to deal with climate change through various means. The private sector could be involved in this regard. We work under one roof with the public sector and the private sector. For instance, IFC is exclusively dealing with private sector, but the World Bank dealing with the public sector. AIIB has the private sector operations department, and I was in charge of the private sector's department in AIIB. So in this bank, we would like to have a very good cooperation and cohesion between public and private sector. I told the young professionals, you should be good both at the public sector and the private sector operations. And there's no actually any chasm between these two sectors. A road is a road. A power plant is a power plant. The financing modality might be a little bit different, but you need to learn to both so that you could be fully deployed. Okay, that's part of the being lean and the cost effectiveness. But private sector also can do a lot of job in this regard. For instance, we recently had this ESG-related, credit portfolio. We buy the bonds of the institutional investors so that they would finance environmental projects and green projects with our resources. Smaller ones, we focus on big ones, but all these institutional investor can focus on smaller ones. We could be more cost effective. We also put money in the private equity fund, like Indians, NIF, National Infrastructure Investment Fund. And they all do this following our standards. So we have very good division of responsibility between us and the private sector. And then also, as you see, when we build up the private sector projects in infrastructure, it's very, very helpful for us to engage the private sector investors. Some people say, please do not crowd out the private sector. I think that's another false assumption. We have 2 or 3 trillion US dollars moving around the globe every day. You, with the pittance of resources, would drive out the private sector. If the private sector is willing to drive you, crowd you in, you are very lucky. Yeah. So don't think you can drive our private sector. Nonsense. That's not true. But how can we involve the private sector investors in long gestation period projects? infrastructure projects have long gestation period. And there's such kind of, uncertainty over the next 5 or 10 years. And particularly, in some of the countries, the government change and their election may affect the performance of a project. So we try to provide comfort to the private sectors by working with them, because we can talk to the top level government officials. And also, since we have private sector operations, in the future we can sell down our assets to pension funds, insurance companies, and engage them. When the project is operating with a steady flow of revenue, the long-term investors would like to buy them. But if you want them to join from day one, they have worries. When it's done, they will buy it. Then we can release our capital without going back to the shareholders asking for money and again and again. So we can involve the private sector people to do a lot of things. That is why we should have a new modus operandi. And business model, I think we are open. We provide loans. We certainly can provide a guarantee. We put money in the private equity fund. We buy their bonds. We want to do a lot of things which has never been done by the existing institutions. As long as it's cost effective, as long as they follow our environmental social standards, we are open. Okay, we need to think outside the box, but more importantly, act outside the box. Now, we should not be the prisoners of the existing, framework, right? Belt Road. Belt Road is a platform. Our bank is a multilateral development institution. These two initiatives proposed by China share the same vision and mission, but the way they operate are very much different. Some people confuse these two. When I talk to quite a number of countries' political leaders, they talk to me in glowing terms about Belt Road, as if I were the president of Belt Road. But I said, please, this is a bank. We were very happy. We'd be very happy to support Belt Road projects as long as they follow our standards. Indeed, we can enhance the quality of the Belt Road projects, but we don't fix labels. Oh, this is Belt Road, this is not Belt Road. I don't think that's the right way.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for clarifying that. Sir, over here.
Hi, good morning, President Jin. Welcome to Singapore. Before I start my one question, I'd like to wish you a happy birthday. I read that today is your birthday, 16th of August, 1949. I will not wish you 100 years old, but I wish you all the best in your health. My question is, due to the trade war between US and China, do you think that such trade war will affect the growth and development and the future of AIIB? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. Over here, please.
Hi, President. My name is Rachel. I'm like a first-year student here at Liquan School. You just talked about young student working really hard in university, and the future with her is unemployment. I think many young professionals and students sitting here today has the same fear of unemployment. What do you think we need to do, especially in school, to prepare for future employment, especially in the time of artificial intelligence? Thank you.
Thank you. Over here, please. Yeah.
My name is James Ye from UOB Hian, a Singapore-based stockbroking house with good ASEAN coverage. We can definitely help you in terms of capital recycle in the region in the future. But my question is very sharp, actually. The first question is, since you mentioned future generation should be ready for AI, come to the telecom and data infrastructure. Chinese companies such as Huawei is clearly leading in terms of technology in a certain way. If you project you are invested, actually the contract are awarded to Huawei, how do you answer and dealing with the skeptical view from the US and ensure the fairness of your business conduct? And then another question is, how do you view, there's a certain view saying that since China have launched One Belt One Road initiative, and some of the European policy financial institutions such as DEG have no more business to do. So how do you see that?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. On this last round, I might take a last question here. Please go ahead, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Jin, and also my following question is actually for both Danny, the Dean, and also Mr. Jin, President. So I'm actually a student, Andre from Hong Kong. I'm a student in School of Public Policy, and I'm also an entrepreneur. And the funny thing is, I believe the next entrepreneurship happens in government and also public policy, and that's why I think I'm here. So my question is, while the Asian Infrastructure Bank is here, but with the context also very shifting and very dynamic, changing of the global developments. So how do you think the young people nowadays can actually make sense of the world and also get ready for truly understanding the global developments instead of simply working under the institutions, simply working under the system as a bankers? How do we really get ready ourselves? Because all along, I'm from international relations background, all along we have to learn it's all about ideology. And but we lack so much practical experience in developing countries. So how does the new bankers, next generation, can really bring in entrepreneurship in especially issues in Asia like DPRK and also Palestine civil issues to really develop the infrastructure? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very broad question on vision. President, I'm going to ask you to have the last word on the set of questions. I'm afraid we won't have time, so I invite you to stand down. But President, can I invite you now to sort of give the last word in terms of the last set of questions or your own take on the vision
I'm
question?
sorry, we will have no time for, I feel very sorry about that, but let me try to address these questions, maybe which could be of some help to you, even though you did not have the chance to raise questions. Trade war, we call it trade dispute. It's not a war, it's a dispute between the United States and China. And I think it will take some time for these two countries to work them out in the interests of both countries themselves and for the rest of the world. It's a little bit tough, and, but does not mean there could be no solution. As you know, there might be some people in the United States who've been calling for decoupling of the US economy from China. Do you think it's possible? I don't think so. When you look at the Cold War days, Soviet Union and US as two superpowers had no economic relations whatsoever. Today, US and the Chinese economies are closely intertwined, and if you want to hurt China, you hurt yourself. So more and more people in the United States, not just the elites, business people, common people, have already felt the pinch of the trade issues. So I think the sensible people in the U.S. would not be supportive of the decoupling. It's not realistic. As for the benefits accruing to the U.S. or China, who get more benefit, who suffer more, something like that. This is a purely psychological issue. The other side of the fence is always greener. Why do you want to engage in trade? Because obviously you make a profit. Otherwise, what's the point of doing that? Americans have made a huge amount of money over the last 4 decades since the normalization relationship. And indeed, when they talk about Chinese surpluses, there's a double accounting, right? So we don't have to go into the details. How long it will take? I think it will still take some time for China and the United States to work them out. I think this dispute has already adversely affected the economies of the Asian countries, particularly. And I think probably the Asian countries should also speak up and express their views. Indeed, when I read Financial Times and all these newspapers, I can see some of the concerns are being voiced. So let's hope for the best. Things will be worked out. I hope I will not, have not scared some of your students here that you'll be losing a job. I don't think so. Since you're the students of this famous university, your job is guaranteed. But as we, development bank, all the schools, look at this, we certainly should be prepared for giving you a better prospect. What I'm driving at is we need to have kind of, reform in the education. We should provide the education which can help our students be fit for the new era. Definitely AI would eliminate lots of traditional jobs. At the same time, new jobs will be created. Throughout the history, ever since industrialization, people thought machines would destroy jobs, computer would destroy jobs. Yes, they did, but more jobs are created. And so don't worry about that. But we really need to think about the future. That's why I said non-physical infrastructure, education, training. But it takes both the students themselves and the faculty and the school authority to think how we should deal with the new era, right? As long as we try to solve the problem, I think we should be convinced that we will deal with that. I think the worst is that you are not even aware of the trend. You are even not prepared for anything of that to happen. That is the big issue. So if you are well prepared, no problem. So I think the competition in the next 10, 20, 30 years will be very tough. But I think competition is fine as long as we compete on level playing field, right? But for instance, some people are very much worried. What if one country, sanctions against the IT companies of another country? But this is, in our words, you lift the stone only to drop it on your own feet. But my view is only by working together, we can push forward the new technology. You cannot block the others from having the new technology developed. Because, for instance, China is investing enormously in R&D, more than any other countries in this world. China has invested more in the green economy. China has invested, particularly the private sector in China, like Huawei. Huawei uses its own money to develop this new technology. I think we need to compete on level playing field. Try to block each other is no solution. In this regard, and I think some of the people in the developed countries should understand, they have managed to develop because of the fair competition. You cannot do the opposite in today's world. But I think a number of people in the developed world should try to adjust themselves to the new era. Asian countries are not booming, not because of textile industries, consumers industries. Asian countries, I'm not just talking about China, would also be competitive in new technology. Developed countries should be prepared for this, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you. That's a stirring vision to end on. I'm afraid that I'm going to have to bring this session to a close. I want to thank everyone in the audience for your attention, your enthusiasm, and all your questions. I know that you have many more issues you want to engage the President on. But to end, could I invite you to join me in thanking President Chin?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.